Hello everyone and welcome to this lesson on introducing Angular. So I will start off with the definition. This is only one possible definition, but I feel it's a good working definition. Angular is a front-end framework for creating single-page applications that is written in TypeScript, and Angular is maintained by a team of developers at Google. Alright, let's break down this definition. Let's examine each of the key terms in this definition one by one. So the first part is, or the first term that we're going to look at is front end. So what do I mean by front end here? Okay, front end is basically referring to the presentation layer. So the Angular application that you write is essentially going to be running, or it's going to be working at the presentation layer of the three-tier web application that we discussed in a previous lesson, right? So we saw at the presentation layer, essentially you're having HTML5, CSS and JavaScript. So your Angular program is essentially going to be converted into a JavaScript program which is going to be running inside your browser and modifying all the various nodes or objects of the DOM tree by reacting to user events. So I've already demonstrated how this happens in the previous lesson. So that's what we mean by front end. Okay, front end means the presentation layer. Now let's talk about this term framework. Okay, now sometimes you will hear the word framework and sometimes you will hear this word library. So what I want to do here is to distinguish between what is meant by this word framework versus what is meant by library. So if you have worked with JavaScript before, you probably will have heard of something called jQuery. Okay, if you have never worked with JavaScript before, it doesn't matter. But if you have worked with JavaScript before, the most popular JavaScript library is called jQuery. Okay, so how is Angular as a framework different from jQuery? jQuery is basically a library, whereas Angular is a framework. So frameworks and libraries, they both contain commonly used code that is grouped together into functions or modules that enable easy reuse. So it's based on code reuse. Okay, and once you have all these functions or modules that are available to you, you can easily reuse them to build more sophisticated applications. So in that respect, frameworks and libraries are identical to each other. Okay, where is the difference? Now with libraries, they allow you complete freedom in how you design the application and how you use the library modules or the library functions. So you can call the functions in any way, at any point in the application, in any style you want, as long as you conform to the API requirements of the library. Okay, so total freedom any way you want. And as I said, the most popular example of a JavaScript library is jQuery. What about a framework? Well, the framework is what we say an opinionated style of programming, in that it provides a very clear direction and style on how to create the application. Okay, so which means that the framework itself makes the decisions on how to construct the application behind the scenes, right? And we only plug in the code at the appropriate places. So we don't have complete freedom. We cannot just use all the modules any way we want. We cannot write the code any single way we want. There's a specific way you have to write the code. Okay, and if you have worked with jQuery before, you are going to see this very clearly when I start introducing Angular to you. You're going to see with Angular, there's only a very specific way that you have to write your code in order to accomplish a specific functionality. You just cannot simply write your code any way you want. Okay, so because the framework makes most of the decisions for you behind the scenes, we call this inversion of control. Inversion of control means now the framework is the one in control of how the app is being constructed, not the developer. Okay, so therefore this means there's less amount of freedom available to the developer. Okay, so you might think that this is kind of a bad thing, But here is the advantage. There is an advantage when there is a clear direction and style. See, the problem with a library is that because there is so many ways to use a library, in a team of developers, you will end up having one developer using the library in a very specific way, and another developer using the library in a very completely different way as well. And as a result, the code becomes very hard to read because it's so very dependent on the developer's style, right? And in a team, you're going to have a lot of developers with different kind of programming styles, as you want to say. With a framework, because everything is constrained and everything has to be done in a certain way, there is uniformity. So it doesn't matter whether the developer has got 2 years of experience or the developer is a JavaScript god, okay? You still have to write the code the same way. Okay, so this makes the code easy to understand, it's uniform, it's consistent. Everybody in the team can read the code and understand what's happening as long as you can understand what the framework is doing. So that's covered. Now let's talk about the next one, which is called what is a single page application, or what is a SPA. Okay, so a single page application is a web application that fits onto a single page, okay, and the resources for the web application is retrieved on the initial load. So on the initial load, that means when you type in the URL of the website into your browser and you get back the initial HTML document, that will say is the initial load. The first time when you hit the website, the web server, all the resources that you need for the web application are retrieved on that first initial load. And then further interaction is accomplished by modifying the DOM, which means that you no longer further load any more HTML. So the first time you load is the first time when you send out the HTTP request to the web server, you get back the HTML, and then after that your Angular program is now going to be running inside your browser, and it will no longer further send out any more requests to load any more extra HTML. Okay, instead what happens is that any request that is made for new content will be written not in the form of HTML, but will be written in the form of what is called JSON. We'll talk about JSON later. JSON is called JavaScript Object Notation. It's a very popular format now for exchanging data across the web. So the request that is sent out to the backend server will now come back as either JSON or XML rather than HTTP, which reduces the latency for better user experience. So why reduced latency is important is because, of course, nowadays everybody is accessing web pages through their mobile phone, and if you have a mobile data connection, it may not be as stable as a wired fiber optic connection. So you obviously want to minimize the amount of bandwidth consumed by the resources that are written from the backend server. So SPAs are useful in that context, because your data is written back from the backend server not in the form of HTML but in the form of JSON or XML. Okay, so the various techniques that you have to accomplish a SPA are obviously JavaScript frameworks. So Angular is what we are learning here, but of course any other JavaScript framework, any other front-end JavaScript framework like React, Vue or Ember can also do the same thing. Other techniques, older techniques are Ajax. If you have worked with JavaScript for a long time, you will probably have heard of Ajax. Ajax is a web development approach that relies on this API called XML HTTP request, or XHR, where the data is transferred between the web browser and the web server, and this XHR is accessible to any JavaScript program running in the browser, so that you can manually construct the functionality of a SPA. So with frameworks like Angular, React, Vue and Ember, the SPA functionality is built into the framework itself, whereas if you use the more traditional Ajax approach, you have to manually construct that functionality yourself. And then the last one is of course something called WebSockets. It's not really very widely used, but it's part of the HTML5 specification, and it's actually considered to be better than Ajax, so it's going to replace Ajax. Okay, although nowadays people don't use Ajax or WebSockets anymore, everybody is pretty much using one of these primary JavaScript frameworks. Okay, so that is SPAs. Now let's move on to talk about TypeScript, right? So before we talk about TypeScript, let's talk about JavaScript. Okay, so JavaScript was created by Brendan Eich at Netscape in 1995. It was adopted as a standard by ECMA, ECMA, which is the European Computer Manufacturers Association. It was adopted as a standard by ECMA in 1997, and it was known by this name, ECMA 262. Okay, and when it was created as a scripting language by Brendan for the company I was working for, Netscape. Netscape was the one that created the browser before Internet Explorer came onto the scene, right? So and now the latest incarnation of Netscape is actually Firefox or Mozilla. Okay, so the first significant revision of the language was in 2009. So in 2009 there was a very major revision of the language, and that was called ES5. Okay, and then in 2015 there was another very, in fact the most significant update to the language was in 2015. That update was called ES6. Okay, and it represents the most significant update to the language to this point in time. So up to this point in time, when people talk about modern JavaScript is essentially ES6. ES6 is the most significant update to the language at this point of time. And then since 2015 up to roughly about 1 or 2 years ago, you have had yearly additions, okay, new updates to the JavaScript language. But ES6 still remains the reference for JavaScript. Now ES6 is fully supported by the latest version of all the major browsers, so Chrome, Edge, Firefox, Safari, and so on. Okay, now the later versions like 2016 up to 2021 onwards, they have varying degrees of support. So some browsers may have support for them, some browsers do not have support for them. Okay, so what we can say at this point of time is most browsers, or basically all modern browsers, will have support for ES6. Okay, so what about TypeScript? So I've talked a bit about JavaScript. Now what about TypeScript? Well, TypeScript is essentially just a superset of JavaScript ES6. Okay, ES6 is the what I just mentioned just now. ES6 is the modern version of JavaScript. So TypeScript is like a even more advanced version of ES6, and it adds in a lot of these additional new features such as static compile time typing. Okay, so typing means adding types. Okay, types like for example integer. If you work with programming languages like Java or C# or C++, you may have heard of data types like integer, float, string, boolean. Okay, all these are types. Now in the original JavaScript is basically dynamically typed. So if you have never worked with JavaScript before, JavaScript basically allows you to dynamically change the type of your variable, which means that 1 minute your variable can be an integer, the next minute your variable can be a string, the next minute your variable can be a boolean. So the type of your variable can just dynamically change anytime you want. Okay, now if you come from a language like C# or Java, that sounds really weird, but that's how JavaScript works. So TypeScript kind of tries to make JavaScript a normal language, normal in the sense that it resembles the other more popular languages like C++, C#, Java, Python, and so on. So static compile time typing is a feature in TypeScript that tries to make JavaScript a properly typed language. Then it adds in things like modules and namespaces for organizing large code bases. And most importantly, TypeScript makes JavaScript into a fully object-oriented language. Okay, so it's kind of, when you use TypeScript is almost already like a fully object-oriented language such as C#, Java, or even Python. Okay, now the original JavaScript is not object-oriented. So if you have ever worked with JavaScript before, you will know it is completely different from the way that objects work in Java or Python or C#. Okay, So TypeScript is like trying to make JavaScript like other so-called normal object-oriented languages, C#, Python, and Java. Okay, so that is essentially TypeScript. Now let's talk about support in browsers. So just now I said ES6 basically is supported in nearly all modern day browsers, or all the latest versions of all the modern browsers like Edge, Firefox, Chrome, and Safari. However, there are still many people who are still using Internet Explorer, who are running it on Windows 7 or even Windows XP, right? Okay, so yes, I mean all those browsers are already outdated. Microsoft doesn't support them anymore. However, there are still many places in the world, people in the world that still use those outdated browsers on outdated operating systems. So if you want to ensure that your application has maximum coverage in terms of what is available, right, then you want to be able to write your application in ES5. ES5 basically is pretty much supported in all browsers, back to browsers that are even 10 years old, including Internet Explorer. Okay, so to guarantee that, there's actually a website here called, this is the URL for the website. You can go to this website and you can check out what kind of features in JavaScript or even in TypeScript are supported in which versions of browsers. Okay, like Firefox supports this particular type of feature. Edge supports this kind of feature, and so on, right? So this website will tell you what are the features that are supported. Now, in order to kind of provide this maximum compatibility, whenever we write code in either ES6 or TypeScript, we need to convert it to ES5 before we send out the program, or we return the program to a browser in order for the program to run in the browser. So although we may construct our program or our application in ES6 or TypeScript, when we actually return the program to the browser in our HTTP response, we must first convert it to ES5 in order to ensure maximum compatibility with the widest amount or the widest coverage of browsers. Okay, so we need to do a process called transpiling. Okay, you probably have heard of the term compiling. Compiling means you take source code and you turn that into executable binaries. So for example, if you are working in C++, you have a C++ file, you typically compile it and you get an executable file with the extension .exe, which can be directly executed by the operating system. So that is called compiling. Okay, transpiling, on the other hand, transpiling is changing from one high-level language into another high-level language. Okay, so compiling is from high-level language into a binary executable, which you can directly run on your operating system, whereas transpiling is from one high-level language into another high-level language. In this case, it's from a more later version of JavaScript or from TypeScript into ES5. ES5, we can consider it to be the uniform JavaScript that every browser in the world understands, even browsers that are 10 years old. So we need to transpile all our programs from either from ES6 or TypeScript into a ES5. And to do that, we have a special program called a transpiler. So if you're writing ES6 programs, if you are writing just pure JavaScript programs in ES6 or even ES7 or ES8 or ES9, you will transpile them into ES5 using Babel. And if you are writing TypeScript programs, so for example Angular, when you write all your Angular programs, they are going to be in TypeScript, you're going to use the TSC transpiler, which will transpile your TypeScript program into ES5. Okay, so because TypeScript at the end of the day is going to be compiled into ES5, so you can, in your TypeScript program, you can write standard ES5 or even ES6 program statements. So you can mix in ES5, you can mix in ES6 statements into your TypeScript program, because at the end of the day, everything is going to still get converted into ES5 before the JavaScript program is sent back to the browser to to be executed. So when the JavaScript program is actually sent back to the browser to be executed, it is always ES5. Alright. Now let's talk about the features of Angular, which we are going to examine in a bit more detail in another lesson. But these are some of the features that make Angular very attractive to use. It's got custom components, data binding, dependency injection. It is very testing centric, which means it generates a lot of test harnesses for you to do testing straight off the bat. It's very comprehensive, so which means that when you fully master the Angular framework, you don't actually have to learn anything else. Every single thing you need to do in a front-end app, you can do that directly from Angular. You won't need to go and get another JavaScript library. Okay, this is not the case for other frameworks like React. Okay, React is more of a UI framework rather than a front-end framework. So when you use React, you still have to use a whole bunch of other libraries like Redux for state management and so on. You don't have to do that for Angular. Angular, it's like a one in all. Everything is contained in it. It's very comprehensive. Okay, and then it's also got a whole bunch of development tools that support it. So other than the Angular CLI, we have things like Material Design, which is part of Google's UI library. So if you like the UI design that Google uses on their web pages, that's already bundled free from you, has already incorporated into the Angular framework. So all of this comes for free in this open source framework. Now, before we end here, I want to talk about this particular framework called AngularJS, because there sometimes is a bit of confusion between this thing called AngularJS and this thing called Angular. So this workshop is actually on Angular. So what is this thing called AngularJS? You may have heard this thing called AngularJS. AngularJS and Angular, they're not exactly the same thing. So I want to just kind of clarify the difference between these two things right at the start. Okay, so AngularJS was one of the first and most popular JavaScript SPA frameworks when it was first introduced in 2009 by Google. So it was the first kind of pioneering SPA framework in JavaScript. Okay, and the second version of AngularJS, okay, was a complete rewrite of the original framework. So that means the team at Google, they completely rewrote the entire framework from scratch. Everything was rewritten from scratch, to the point that applications that were developed in AngularJS could not run in the Angular 2.0 framework because it was a total complete rewrite. Okay, then all the subsequent versions onwards, so from Angular 2.0 onwards up to the latest version of Angular, so at the point of this presentation, the latest version of Angular is 14, but it may already have moved on. From Angular 2 to 14 onwards, pretty much all these successive versions are all nearly the same because they only involve incremental upgrades. So the major change was going from AngularJS to Angular 2.0. There's a totally complete rewrite. Okay, so therefore what happened is that in order to ensure that people who had already spent a lot of time developing their apps using AngularJS did not have to waste their time learning Angular 2.0 again, the community that developed AngularJS continued to maintain AngularJS. So AngularJS is still available for download and for you to use, but pretty much everybody who is new to Angular uses Angular 2.0 onwards. So when I use the term Angular 2.0, it's actually referring to all the versions of Angular from 2.0 onwards up to the latest version 14, because they're all pretty much nearly identical except for some minor incremental upgrades. Okay, so therefore the recommendation is to use Angular if you are new. So that's what we are going to be doing in this workshop. Now, just as a matter of interest, if we go to the AngularJS webpage, it actually tells you that AngularJS support has officially ended as of January 2022. So that means AngularJS is already no longer even available, it's no longer actively supported, there's no longer a community of developers supporting it, and the recommendation is to try the new Angular, which is what we are going to be studying in this workshop.